The Vethkari had a word for humans. It translated, imprecisely, as the ones who choose badly and survive anyway. It was not meant as a compliment. Senior linguist advisor S.S. Varath had spent 11 of her 300 years studying the species. She had read every intercepted transmission. She had modeled their decision trees, mapped their conflict records, cataloged the wars they had fought against themselves, which were, statistically speaking, more numerous and more destructive than any war they had fought against anyone else. She had built the case, brick by brick, that humanity was manageable, containable, predictable in their unpredictability, which was itself a kind of predictability. She had presented her findings to the High Convocation 7 times. She had been wrong 7 times. She just didn't know it yet. The sea of dust was not a metaphor. It had been a sea once, 3,000 years ago, before the Vethkari arrived and scorched the atmosphere of what humanity now called GX7 in their catalog notation, and what the original colonists had called Ardenmere. They had been a small colony, 17,000 people, agricultural, pre-industrial, the kind of settlement that the Vethkari Expansion Directorate classified as Category 1, negligible resistance, harvest viable. The ocean had evaporated in 43 hours. The colonists had lasted about as long. What remained was 700 kilometers of pale alkaline flat, glittering under a dying red sun, completely featureless except for the fortress. The fortress was old, older than the Vethkari colony that had been built around it, older than the scorching, older than Ardenmere's name. It had been built by something that preceded all of them, and it held in its deepest chamber the Arx Orthian. The Vethkari called it the Scourge of Worlds. The name was accurate. Sergeant First Class Mara Keth had been walking toward it for 6 days. She had started with a team of 4. Das had been the first to go, not to the Vethkari, but to the terrain. On the second day he had walked into a sinkhole concealed beneath the dust's surface crust, dropped 3 meters into a pocket of residual brine, and been dead before anyone could reach him. The alkaline saturation had been total. There had been nothing to bury. Yennik had lasted until day 4, when the Vethkari patrol had swept the eastern corridor. He'd bought the other 3 an extra 6 hours by running north. She didn't let herself think about what that had cost him. She filed it under necessary and kept moving. Rhea had made it to day 5 before her filtration unit failed. The dust in this part of GX7 carried microscopic particulate that standard-issue rebreathers weren't rated for, a detail that had been in the mission briefing as a footnote. A footnote with the phrase, acceptable degradation timeline of 96-120 hours. Rhea's had lasted 81. She had given Mara her water before she stopped breathing, because Rhea had been that kind of person, and she had sat down in the dust with something that was almost serenity on her face, and she had not gotten up again. That left Mara, Sergeant First Class Mara Keth, 3rd Expeditionary, attached to the Reclamation Intelligence Corps, carrying a pack that weighed 42 kilograms and a mission dossier that she had memorized so thoroughly she could recite it backwards, which she sometimes did at night to keep her mind from going to the dark places. The mission dossier said the Arx Orthian was a weapon built by a species that no longer existed. The mission dossier said that species had called themselves the Orin, and they had built the weapon to end a war that had consumed their civilization for 2 centuries, and that the weapon had ended the war, and also the Orin, and also most of the star system in which they had lived. The mission dossier said the weapon had been moved here, to this fortress, to this Dead Sea, by the last surviving Orin, a woman whose name translated as something like Keeper of the Final Choice, and it had been sealed behind 3 wards that would require a specific key to open. The Vethkari had the key. Or rather, the Vethkari commander who had been sent to retrieve the Arx Orthian had the key. Her name was Ariadne Class Designation 7, which was not a name but a rank serial designation that the Vethkari used for their senior military strategists. Mara's mission briefing had given her a physical description, a psychological profile, a list of known behaviors under stress, and the intelligence assessment that Ariadne 7 was currently 3 days ahead of Mara, and that she intended to open the weapon and deploy it against the human fleet assembling in the Keth 4 system. The intel also said that Avethkari Designation 7 was functionally immune to conventional human assault. Their neural architecture, combined with a Tier 4 psionic shielding implant, meant that within a certain proximity radius, any human who intended harm would find their nervous system simply redirecting. Hands that reached for weapons would put them down. Legs that moved to charge would turn and walk away. It was not pain. It was not coercion in any sense that humans could recognize. It was simply the body deciding, with perfect calm, that it did not want to do the thing the mind was asking it to do. The mission briefing said there was no known countermeasure. The mission briefing was wrong, but Mara didn't know that yet either. She was working on it. The fortress emerged from the haze on the morning of the 7th day. She stopped when she saw it, more from the weight of finally arriving than from any tactical consideration, and she stood there in the dust for a long moment with the red sun behind her and the structure ahead and the emptiness of this world sitting on her shoulders like a physical mass. It was built from something that was not stone and not metal. The Oran material had a quality to it that made the eyes slide, like looking at a color that didn't have a name. It rose in a series of graduated towers that leaned slightly inward, as if they had spent millennia bowing toward whatever was at the center. The walls were covered in carvings. She had read about the carvings in the mission briefing. She had been told they were decorative. She knew immediately, looking at them, that they were not. She pulled out her scanner and got moving. 3 days behind Ariadne 7 meant the Vethkari had probably already been inside. The question was whether they'd gotten what they came for. The fortress gate was open. Not forced open, not blown or cut or burned. Open in the way a door is open when someone has a key and the grace to close it behind them. Mara noted this. She noted the footprints in the dust just inside. Vethkari were bipedal, but their stride pattern was distinctive. A slightly outward rotation of the rear foot, 3 small toes and 2 large ones. She noted that the footprints going in were accompanied by 6 other sets. She noted that the 6 other sets did not appear in any footprints coming out. She filed all of this and went inside. The outer halls were empty. Not abandoned empty. Present empty, the kind of empty that has edges to it. Mara moved slowly, checking corners, running her scanner along the walls. The carvings here were denser than outside, layered over each other in a way that suggested centuries of accretion. The Oran had come back to this place again and again. She photographed everything. Old habit, old training. Document first. Understand later. The fortress had been built in concentric rings. She understood after the first few minutes. Each ring was older than the one outside it. The carvings deepened in their density and their legibility as she moved inward, as if the Oran had written their earliest statements on the outer walls and their final ones near the center. It was backwards from the way humans archived things, where the oldest material was often most degraded. Here the preservation was deliberate, nested, closer to the heart, better kept. She stopped at one section of wall that drew her for a reason she couldn't immediately articulate. The carvings here were different in their rhythm, shorter lines, repeated structures, something almost metronomic. She photographed it twice and ran the scanner over it and got 3 different partial translations that didn't reconcile. She filed the photograph and noted the discrepancy and kept moving. She was here for the artifact, not a research grant. But she was also here in a fortress built by people who had wanted someone to read it, and it felt like a kind of discourtesy not to try. There had been a professor at Fort Karis, not a military instructor but a civilian attached to the Corps Xenocultural Division, who had told Mara's cohort on the first day of training that the single most dangerous thing in any contact situation was the assumption that you already understood. Not the aliens, not the weapons, The assumption that what you expected was what you would find, that your model would fit the world you walked into. Mara had thought about that professor a great deal in the last 11 days. She was in a wide corridor, maybe 15 meters across, when her scanner chirped. Not an alarm, a soft note, the recognition tone it made when it identified something in its cultural archive. She looked at the screen. The scanner had matched a motif in the wall carving to a symbol in the Oran linguistic database, one of the fragments of their writing system that human xenographers had painstakingly reconstructed from ruins on 6 different worlds. The symbol meant choice. She looked at the carving more carefully. It was a sequence, figures approaching a central point from many directions, each path slightly different, each figure carrying something different. And at the center, where all the paths converged, was a single door. And in front of the door was a single figure with empty hands. She stood there for a long time, reading the wall. The Oran hadn't hidden the Orcs Orthian because they were afraid it would fall into the wrong hands. They had hidden it here, in this dead place, behind this fortress covered in these carvings, because they wanted whoever came for it to understand what it was first. They had made a museum. They had made a monument. They had made the world's most elaborate warning label. She photographed all of it. She moved on. She found the Vethkari soldiers at the inner gate. 5 of them. They were alive, barely sedated perhaps, arranged with unsettling care against the corridor wall in a row, their weapons neatly stacked 2 meters away. Ariadne 7's work, she suspected. The 6th set of footprints hadn't emerged because one of the 6 had remained here, was stationed somewhere ahead. But the 5 on the floor had not been killed. She crouched next to the nearest one. A young male, by the scale of his secondary color patches, Vethkari's sexual differentiation was subtle, more behavioral than structural, and she had studied enough of it to read the markers. His breathing was steady. His eyes were open but tracking nothing. She checked his equipment. His detonation key was clipped to his secondary harness, a standard-issue hexagonal chip about the size of her thumbnail. She looked at it for a moment. The mission briefing said Ariadne 7 had the key. But the mission briefing had been compiled on intelligence that was 48 hours old by the time it was delivered to her, and 11 days old by the time she was standing here. A lot could change in 11 days. She took the chip. It was not something she thought about carefully. It was not a plan, not yet. It was just the old training, if it might be useful, take it. She pocketed it and kept moving. The inner gate had been opened by the key. The lock mechanism was still warm. She was 20 meters past it when the sentinel activated. It came from the ceiling, dropped from a recess she hadn't seen, too fast for her to bring up her weapon before it had oriented on her. It hung in the air at roughly eye level, 3 meters away, and she had time to register its shape. A dense spherical body maybe a meter across, dark like the artifact material, with a ring of what were either sensory organs or apertures evenly spaced around its equator, each one currently pointing at her. Her weapon was in her hand. She didn't remember drawing it. The thing floated and watched her. It made no sound. It did not move. She did not move either. She understood in the careful analytical part of her mind that had been very busy over the last 11 days, that this was Oran technology, not Vethkari, not human, built by the same hands that had carved the walls. Which meant it had been here for at least 3,000 years, which meant it was either powered by something she didn't understand, or it ran on something long since depleted. The 6 Vethkari soldiers had made it past it, or most of them had. Ariadne 7 had definitely made it through. The thing hadn't killed them. But she was looking at its apertures, and she was reading them the same way she read everything in this place, not as combat variables but as communication. A ring of eyes looking at her, a body in the air between her and the door. It was not attacking, it was not retreating. It was waiting for something. She thought about the entrance corridor wall, figures on many paths converging on a door, an empty-handed figure standing before it. Not receiving the artifact and not walking away, the ambiguity she had been unable to resolve. What if the ambiguity was the point? What if the Oran threshold wasn't about what happened after you arrived, but about how you arrived? Whether you came as someone who had already decided, with a weapon drawn and a plan in place, or whether you came as someone still in the process of deciding. She looked at the sentinel. She put her weapon down. Not on the floor, she kept hold of it. She dropped it to her side, barrel toward the ground, hand still loose on the grip but not ready, not aimed. A position that said, I have the capability and I'm not using it in this moment. The sentinel drifted back about 30 centimeters. She walked forward, it didn't stop her. The apertures tracked her movement, but the body didn't reposition. It let her pass, keeping its ring of attention on her until she was beyond its range, and then it ascended back toward the ceiling recess, and she heard nothing else. Her hands were shaking. She noted this with a kind of clinical detachment and filed it under manageable. The inner gate had been opened by the key. The lock mechanism was still warm. The chamber beyond was everything the mission briefing had promised, and nothing like the mission briefing had described. The briefing had called it a vault. It was not a vault. Vaults were built to contain things. This space had been built to present something, to hold it up in a kind of permanent offering, to let light fall on it from angles that did not obviously correspond to any light source. It was circular, maybe 40 meters across, the ceiling lost in darkness above. The walls were solid carved Oran text, not decoration, not warning, but something denser than either. It looked like the entire history of a civilization, compressed into stone. And in the center, on a plinth of the same nameless material as the fortress walls, rested the Oryx Orthian. It was smaller than she had expected, about the size of a large book, dark, non-reflective, with a surface texture that made her scanner go briefly silent before recovering. It sat in a shallow depression in the plinth and radiated nothing she could measure. No heat, no radiation, no electromagnetic signature, just mass, just presence. Just wait. She heard a sound behind her and turned. Ariadne 7 was standing at the far wall, reading it. Mara's hand went to her sidearm and stopped. Not because of the psionic shielding, though she felt it, a faint pressure at the base of her skull, a gentle suggestion that her hand was tired, that her weapon was heavy, that this moment was not the moment. She pushed back against it. That surprised her. The briefing had said it was irresistible, but it was just pressure. Pressure could be resisted if you'd spent enough time learning the difference between what you wanted to do and what your body was doing without your permission. Lyta had called it body knowing back when they'd trained together at Fort Karis. You know before you know. The hand is already on the knife before the brain finishes the sentence. The trick isn't to fight it. The trick is to redirect it. Mara's hand came off the sidearm. Not because the shielding had won, because she had decided. You're reading the wall, she said. Ariadne 7 turned. The Vethkari were humanoid in the basic bilateral sense. 2 limbs for locomotion, 2 for manipulation, sensory clusters concentrated in a cranial structure. Beyond that, the resemblance ended. Ariadne 7 was tall, nearly 2.5 meters, with a secondary spine that curved her torso into a permanent subtle lean. Her skin, if it could be called that, was a banded iridescent gray, with color shifts that moved through patterns too fast for Mara to consciously track. Her eyes were compound, not insect compound but densely faceted, like polished obsidian broken into 100 facets. She wore combat armor that moved with her like a second skin. She was objectively magnificent. She looked at Mara with those compound eyes and she said, in the galactic trade pidgin that had become the de facto contact language since the war began, you came alone. I started with 4. Something moved in the facets of Ariadne 7's eyes, not pity exactly. More like the kind of acknowledgement you give to something surprising in a data model. How? Badly, Mara said. There was a pause that stretched in a direction she couldn't quite identify. I am told, Ariadne 7 said, that humans make poor choices and survive. The linguist advisor who prepared my intelligence profile emphasized this. She seemed to think it was a significant vulnerability. She's not wrong, Mara said. We make terrible choices. We just don't stop at the ones that kill us. Ariadne 7 turned back to the wall. I have been reading this for 2 hours, she said. The Oran language is partially deciphered in our historical records. I can understand perhaps 60% of what is written here. I can understand about 45, Mara said. But I got more from the entrance corridor. The Vethkari strategist turned again, faster this time. A new quality had entered the color patterns across her skin, something that moved in quick spiraling bursts, which Mara had learned from the briefing and from the wall carvings in the entrance corridor, was the Vethkari equivalent of recalibration, of surprise being processed into assessment. Show me, Ariadne 7 said. It was, Mara would later think, the most unusual negotiation of the war. They stood together in the entrance corridor, and Mara walked Ariadne 7 through what the scanner had found. The symbol sequence, the figures on many paths, the empty-handed figure at the door. She explained the Oran linguistic notation system as she understood it, the way verbs were written as conditions rather than actions, the way their grammar encoded probability rather than certainty. Not she opened the door, but the door became open as one possible outcome of her presence. The distinction mattered because the Oran appeared to have understood choice not as something a self made, but as something a self became temporarily capable of, a condition that opened and closed, that required specific circumstances and specific postures of attention. Their word for decision was the same as their word for threshold. Their word for mistake was the same as their word for path not chosen, which contained no negative judgment, just the acknowledgement of roads not taken, which accumulated behind any life like a shadow with 1,000 edges. Mara had spent 40 minutes in the entrance corridor before Ariadne 7 found her there, re-examining the full sequence. She had been trying to reconcile 2 sections that seemed to contradict each other. One section showed the empty-handed figure at the door receiving the artifact. Another showed the empty-handed figure walking away from it. The scanner could not determine the temporal relationship between the 2 images, whether they were sequential or simultaneous in the Oran visual grammar, whether they represented 2 different figures or one figure in 2 different futures. She had not resolved it. She had filed it under uncertain and kept moving, because that was what you did with things that couldn't be resolved yet. Ariadne 7 was very still while she listened. The color patterns in her skin slowed. She was, Mara realized, genuinely paying attention in a way that had nothing to do with combat assessment or threat modeling. The Vethkari strategist was curious. The Oran are extinct, Ariadne 7 said. Yes. The weapon exists. Yes. And they built this fortress not as a security measure, but as, she paused, and the pause was not her searching for words but her testing the weight of the word she had. As testimony. They wanted whoever came here to understand what it costs, Mara said. They deployed it. They won. And then they spent the last years of their civilization building a monument to why they wished they hadn't. The color patterns moved, slow now, almost contemplative. My mission, Ariadne 7 said carefully, is to retrieve the Orcs Orthian and use it against your fleet. I know. Your mission is to prevent me. Yes. Then we have a conflict of objectives that the information on these walls cannot resolve. Maybe, Mara said. The Vethkari strategist turned to look at her, and there was something new in the compound eyes, a quality Mara didn't have a word for, and suspected the mission briefing hadn't mentioned because SS Vareth had never cataloged it, because it might not have been in the data, because it might have been the kind of thing that only showed up when a senior Vethkari strategist stood in a dead alien fortress on a dead world and looked at a human soldier who had walked 6 days through a poisonous wasteland to have a conversation that neither of them had been sent here to have. "Perhaps," Ariadne 7 said, "you will tell me how your hand did not complete its reach for your weapon." Mara considered lying. It would have been easy. She'd been trained in Vethkari psychology. She knew what was plausible, but something about the dust still in the creases of her hands, and the weight of Das and Yennik and Rhea somewhere behind her in the white flat, made lying feel like a waste of whatever this was. "You were reading the wall," she said. "Your back was turned. Your shielding wasn't fully active, I could feel it, but it wasn't at full suppression. If I'd wanted you dead, I had a window of about 4 seconds. She paused. "But you were reading the wall." Another pause that stretched in that unnameable direction. "I do not understand the distinction you are making," Ariadne 7 said. "I know," said Mara. "That's why I'm making it." They went back to the central chamber together. The Orcs Orthian sat on its plinth and did not care about either of them. Mara stood at the far wall and finished reading the text there. Ariadne 7 watched her. Occasionally, the Vethkari strategist would indicate a symbol she couldn't read, and Mara would translate what she could, and the conversation would extend like a vine-finding wall, natural and unhurried, in a way that was almost entirely unlike the 11 days that had preceded it. "The Orin had a phrase," Mara said, scanning a dense passage near the floor. "It comes up 6 times in this chamber. The scanner flags it as a key term, but the translation is difficult. Literally, it comes out as something like, 'the path that ends the paths.' Their language uses a lot of metaphor structures that—" "I know this phrase," Ariadne 7 said. Mara looked up. "In our records, it is called the Orthian terminus, the condition that would result from the weapon's deployment. It was the subject of a high convocation debate 60 cycles ago. The color patterns moved in a long, slow undulation. The debate was not resolved." What were they debating? Whether the Orcs Orthian is a weapon that ends wars, or a weapon that ends the capacity for war. Ariadne 7 moved closer to the plinth. She did not touch the artifact. The distinction matters. The Expansion Directorate's position is that these are the same thing. The Linguist Advisor Corps, SS Vareth's division, argued they were not. That deploying it would render the victor incapable of further conflict. That it would neutralize not just the enemy, but the will that animates any civilization's continuation. Myra was quiet for a moment. "It doesn't just destroy," she said. "It defeats." "Yes. And a civilization that has been completely defeated cannot rebuild, cannot expand, cannot threaten, and also cannot grow." The compound eyes caught the sourceless light of the chamber and held it in their facets. "The Expansion Directorate considers this acceptable." "And you?" The color pattern stopped moving entirely. Mara had never seen a Vethkari go completely still before. She wasn't sure if it was significant. "I have been a soldier for 90 of my 300 years, Ariadne 7 said. "I have ended 14 campaigns. I have not lost a mission in 62 years of active command." A pause. "I have never before stood in a room with the last testament of a civilization that built the instrument of its own ending, and then came back to write on the walls about it." "Neither have I," said Mara, "for what it's worth." "It is worth something," Ariadne 7 said. "I'm attempting to determine how much." The 6th soldier found them there. He came in at speed. One of the soldiers from the outer corridor, recovered earlier than Mara had estimated, moving on a training response that didn't require consciousness to activate. He had his weapon up, and he had it aimed at Mara, and she saw his intent clearly in the angle of the barrel, and the set of his secondary spine, and the way his color patterns had gone to pure combat flat gray. Ariadne 7 said one word in Vethkari. The soldier stopped. Mara had spent enough time with the mission briefing to parse approximately 30% of spoken Vethkari. The word Ariadne 7 had used was not in her vocabulary. But the soldier had lowered his weapon, and his color patterns had shifted to something that looked like confusion, and he was looking at his commander the way soldiers look at a superior who has just countermanded an order they were completely certain was coming. The soldier said something else. Ariadne 7 replied. A short exchange, too fast and too dense for Mara to follow. Then the soldier looked at Mara with an expression she couldn't read and looked back at his commander and left. What did you tell him? Mara asked. That you were not a threat at present. Ariadne 7 paused. That I was still assessing. And what did he say? The color patterns moved in a way that Mara had not seen before. A rapid, brief spiral that collapsed into stillness. She would later catalog it as the Vethkari equivalent of something rueful. He said that you were human, and that therefore any assessment was likely to be overturned regardless. Mara laughed. She hadn't laughed in 11 days, and it came out rougher than she intended, more like something breaking loose than something free. And Ariadne 7 regarded her with those compound eyes, and the color patterns moved very slowly in a way that Mara couldn't name and wouldn't try to. He is not wrong, Mara said when she had caught herself. We do overturn assessments. Frequently, Ariadne 7 agreed. Does that bother you? A pause. It is difficult to build a campaign model around a variable that does not stabilize. Another pause with more weight. We have been modeling human behavior for 30 years. We have very good data. And yet here you are, having walked 6 days across the sea of dust alone and alive, and our predictions place the probability of your survival at 3.7%. We had a linguist at Fort Caris, Mara said. She used to say the only way to predict humans was to know what they cared about. And what do you care about? Mara looked at the Orcs Orthian on its plinth, at the walls of Oran text around them, at the fortress built by a civilization that had cared enough about what they'd done to spend their last years explaining it to whoever came after. Getting home, she said, all of them, not just the ones I started with. The standoff happened an hour later. Mara had known it was coming. The 6th soldier had gone to get the others. There had been 6 Vethkari in the patrol, which meant at least 2 more she hadn't accounted for, and the sound of movement in the outer corridors had been building for the last 20 minutes. Ariadne 7 had to have known it too. What she hadn't predicted was Ariadne 7 standing between Mara and the door when the other soldiers arrived. 5 of them, weapons raised, color patterns in full combat flat. Mara's hand was on her sidearm. Her finger was not on the trigger. She was watching the Vethkari commander, and she was doing the calculation that Rhea would have called unnecessary because Rhea had been that kind of practical person, and Rhea was dead in the dust. Ariadne 7 spoke. The soldiers responded. The exchange was longer than the one with the 6th soldier, more heated, Mara thought, though Vethkari effect was difficult to read. One of the soldiers gestured at Mara specifically and used a word that appeared from context to be a question. Ariadne 7 answered it. The soldier's color pattern shifted. Not all the way to combat flat gray. Something between that and the contemplative stillness Mara had seen on Ariadne 7 in the chamber. Something in transition. They are asking why I have not retrieved the artifact, Ariadne 7 said, without turning. What are you telling them? That I am still assessing. A pause. They find this insufficient. Reasonable, Mara said. Yes, another pause. I am going to tell them something else now. I want you to understand before I do that this is not a decision I have made lightly, and that it carries significant professional consequences for me, and that I am making it because the Oran text on these walls used a grammatical form that my records associate specifically with last testaments. Mara said nothing. She waited. I am going to tell them, Ariadne 7 said, that the artifact cannot be retrieved, that the fortress security system has assessed both parties and sealed the inner chamber, that we have reached an impasse that requires convocation review before proceeding. None of that is true, Mara said. No, said Ariadne 7, but it will buy approximately 40 Vethkari days before the convocation can convene and rule. Which is, I understand, approximately 26 of your standard days. Which is, I further understand, enough time for a human fleet to exit the Keth 4 system and reposition beyond the range of deployment. Mara was quiet for a moment. Not stunned. She had used the 42-kilometer march across a dead world to run scenarios, and some of them had involved this exact conversation, and she had always concluded it was a fantasy. She had been wrong, but in the right direction. She noted this. They'll know, she said, when the convocation sends an investigation team. By then the conditions will have changed. The war may have changed. The compound eyes caught the light. And I am a designation 7. It is not common for us to be questioned on the facts of a field assessment. It will take time to build a case against my report. In that time, many things can happen. Why, Mara said. And Ariadne 7 was quiet for a long moment, and the color patterns moved in something that Mara had never seen, and would spend years trying to describe and would eventually stop trying because the closest human analog she could find was the look on Ria's face when she'd given Mara her water. The particular expression of a person who has decided to pay a price they cannot recover. Because the Oran were not a stupid species, Ariadne 7 said, and they built this monument because they wanted someone to understand. I would like to be the first of my kind to understand it. She turned briefly and looked at Mara with those faceted compound eyes. And because you did not complete the reach for your weapon. She turned back to her soldiers and spoke. Mara was outside the fortress when it ended. She didn't know what Ariadne 7 had said. She didn't know if the soldiers had believed it. She knew that they had let her walk out, which was either because of the designation 7's authority or because of something else. Some quality in Ariadne 7's presentation that she would have given a great deal to understand. She walked back across the alkaline flat with the sun lowering toward the horizon, red on white, casting shadows from nothing because there was nothing to cast them from. The part that occupied her, as she walked, was not the practical question of what had just happened. She was a soldier. She would file the practical questions in her report and let analysts with better data and more sleep figure out the implications. What occupied her was something smaller and more stubborn. The moment in the chamber when Ariadne 7 had described the convocation debate over the Orcs Orthian, the 60-cycle disagreement between the Expansion Directorate and SS Varath's linguistic advisors. The fact that the debate had existed at all. The fact that there had been Vethkari who had looked at the weapon and said, "This is not the same as ending the war." She had been briefed on the Vethkari as a monolith. That was always how the briefings worked, in her experience. You needed to be able to think about the enemy quickly, in high-stress conditions, and quick thinking required a simplified model. The Vethkari were the Expansion Directorate. They were territorial acquisition at civilizational scale. They were the thing that had boiled Ardenmir's oceans and killed 17,000 farmers and kept going without looking back. That was all true. She wasn't trying to revise it. But Ariadne 7 had read the wall for 2 hours before she noticed Mara was there. She filed that. She didn't know what to do with it yet. She filed it under uncertain, same shelf as the contradictory images in the entrance corridor, the figure receiving the weapon and the figure walking away. One figure, 2 futures, a threshold, a choice that hadn't resolved into a single outcome. Maybe that was the point, she thought. Maybe the Oran hadn't resolved it either. Maybe the point of the monument was not to give an answer but to make the question impossible to ignore. She walked for about 40 minutes before she sat down. She walked for about 40 minutes before she sat down. She sat in the dust, and she pulled the detonation chip from her pocket, the chip from the sedated soldier in the corridor, not the key to the inner chamber. And she held it in her palm, and she thought about Das and the sinkhole, and Yennik running north, and Rhea sitting down in the white flat with serenity on her face. And she felt the weight of all that in the exact way you feel weight when you're too tired to pretend it isn't there. She thought about what Ariadne 7 had bought, 26 standard days. She thought about what that meant in terms of fleet movements, in terms of engagement probabilities, in terms of the specific calculations that the people in the Keth 4 system were running right now. She was not an admiral. She was not a strategic analyst. She was a sergeant first class with a 42-kilogram pack and a mission dossier and the weight of her team on her. And she understood maybe a third of what she'd just been part of. But she understood this. Something had changed in that chamber. Something had moved. Not the war, not yet. Wars were large, slow things that required enormous force to redirect. But the people in the war, 2 of them, one at a time. She put the chip back in her pocket. She stood up. She did one more thing before she left the spot. It was not in any field manual. It was not tactical. She took 3 small stones from the surface of the flat, white, alkaline, perfectly ordinary, and placed them in a rough triangle in the dust. And she said 3 names into the empty air, once each, quietly, the way you say names when there is no one to hear them, and that's exactly the point. Then she oriented herself by the stars coming out above the red horizon, navigation by stellar position, another Fort Kara skill, and she started walking. The extraction point was 112 kilometers away. She had approximately enough water for 80 of them, which was a problem she intended to solve in the remaining 32. She hummed while she walked. An old song, something her grandmother had sung. She couldn't have said why she remembered it now, whether it was the exhaustion or the particular quality of the silence out here, or something about the way the Orin had built their walls to say things that couldn't be said in briefings. Her grandmother had been from a coastal city that no longer existed, one of the first to fall in the early years of the war, and she had taught Mara this song when Mara was 7 years old, sitting on a porch that also no longer existed, watching a sunset over a sea that was still a sea. She hummed it into the dead Ardenmere night. The Vethkari called it many things afterward. In the official convocation record, it was logged as the Ardenmere Impasse, a field assessment by designation 7 Ariadne, citing unresolved security protocols in the Orin Fortress, recommending delay pending full archaeological survey and convocation review before any attempt to retrieve the Oryx Orthian. The assessment had been accepted. It had been contested, eventually, and Ariadne 7 had been removed from active strategic command and reassigned to what the Vethkari called an interpretive role, which was not a demotion in the human sense, but was something more complicated and more lasting, a kind of professional exile that kept her influence contained. She appeared, 40 cycles later, as a named representative on the first human Vethkari contact panel. SS Vareth, the linguist advisor, revised her intelligence model for humanity 14 times over the following 2 decades. The revisions grew progressively less confident in their conclusions and progressively more precise in their uncertainty, which was a kind of scholarly progress even if it felt like anything but. Mara made it to the extraction point on water she found in a subsurface deposit that the Geological Survey had rated as probably dry but not certainly dry, which was exactly the margin she had needed. She was debriefed for 9 hours. She submitted a 27-page field report that included complete scanner documentation of the Orin Fortress text, a preliminary linguistic analysis, and a recommendation that an academic team be sent to Ardenmere before any military action was taken. The recommendation was filed and ignored for 3 years. Then it was acted on, because the war had stalled in ways that made everyone reconsider everything, and the Oran material turned out to be some of the most significant xenoarchaeological documentation ever recovered, and the specific grammatical form that Ariadne 7 had mentioned, the one associated with Last Testaments, contained, in its syntax, the clearest description anyone had ever found of how the Orcs Orthian actually worked, and the clearest description of what it would cost. The convocation received the translation 14 months after the academic team's first report. The high strategist read it in private and did not speak for an entire day. The war did not end that year. Wars don't end quickly, not wars of that scale, not wars that have their own momentum and their own weight and their own populations of people who have lost enough that stopping feels like losing. It took 7 more years. It took a great many things that Mara was not in the room for and could not take credit for. But there was a moment, early in the final negotiations, when the Vethkari delegation's senior linguistic advisor, a young scholar named Varath, second generation of SS Varath's research team, presented the human delegation with a translation of the Oran Last Testament in full. And a human scholar on the delegation looked up from the document and looked at the Vethkari scholar and said, in the trade pidgin that had become, after 30 years of war, almost a shared language, "They built all of this just to tell us." And Varath said, "Yes, they wanted whoever came to understand." And the human scholar said, "Well, we're trying." The Orcs Orthian remained on its plinth. As far as anyone knew, it was still there. Ardenmere was a designated protected site under the joint treaty. Nobody had attempted to remove the artifact. Nobody had seriously proposed it in 20 years. The question of what it was, specifically, what it would do if activated, whether the Oran text was a precise technical description or a philosophical metaphor or something the human mind was simply not equipped to parse correctly, all of that remained unresolved, would probably remain unresolved, was perhaps designed to remain unresolved. The fortress stood. The carvings said what they said. The red sun moved across the white flat every 41-hour day, and the shadows fell, and the silence continued, and the sea of dust held its patience. Mara Keth retired from the Corps at 54, on the 5th anniversary of the treaty. She taught field linguistics at Fort Caris for 11 years. She never talked much about Ardenmere in public, though she had given a classified debrief that had been read by, among others, 3 secretaries of contact and 1 Vethkari high strategist. Her students knew, in the way students always know when a teacher has done something that matters and chooses not to explain it. There was something in the way she handled contact simulations, a quality of patience in the face of apparent deadlock, a willingness to let silence run longer than was comfortable, a habit of asking what the other party was looking at rather than what they were planning, that marked her as someone who had found those principles in the field rather than in a classroom. She was a difficult teacher in certain respects. She did not give clean lessons. She gave situations, and when students proposed solutions, she asked them to identify what they were assuming, and then to identify what they were assuming about their assumptions. It was maddening. Several students transferred out of her cohort in the first 2 years. The ones who stayed tended to be the ones who could sit with unresolved questions, without treating the unresolved state as a failure. Those were the students who went on to do interesting work. She kept the detonation chip. It sat on her desk. Not as a trophy. She was not a person who kept trophies. She kept it because it was small and she had taken it without a plan, and she liked to remember that some of the most significant things she had ever done had started without a plan. That the plan had come later, improvised, shaped by the moment and the person across from her and the carvings on the walls. She also kept it because it was, technically, inert Vethkari military hardware, and the treaty technically required that all such hardware be surrendered to the Joint Decommission Registry, and she had never surrendered it, and she was fairly certain at least one person in the diplomatic corps knew she hadn't surrendered it, and they had apparently decided this was not a fight worth having. She respected that decision. She understood it. That was, she would tell students, the thing about the job. You prepared as much as you could, and you documented everything, and you read the briefings until you could recite them backward. And then you went out into the field and something happened that wasn't in the briefing, and you made a choice. And sometimes you made the wrong choice and it killed you. And sometimes you made the wrong choice and it bought 26 days. And sometimes you stood in a dead alien fortress on a dead world next to someone who had come to take a weapon that would end a war, and instead of completing the reach for your weapon, you asked what she was reading. And the war ended anyway, differently, with more left over. The leftover part was the part that mattered, she told her students. Anyone could end a war. The hard thing, the thing the Orin had tried to say in all those meters of carved text, the thing they had given up their last surviving energy to say, was what you kept, what the ending didn't take from you, what remained in the room after the last choice was made. Her students wrote it down. Some of them understood it immediately. Others carried it for years before it opened. She thought that was probably right. There is an account, informal, circulated in the Vethkari diplomatic archive, not widely translated, of a conversation between Ariadne 7 and Varath, her research successor, recorded approximately 8 years after the events on Ardenmere. Varath had been working through the Orin translation corpus and had come to the section of the inner chamber text that dealt with what the Orin called the Orthian terminus, the condition that resulted from the weapon's deployment. The translation was dense and contested, with multiple human and Vethkari scholarly teams offering different readings. Varath had asked Ariadne 7, who had been present in the chamber and had read the text directly, what she remembered of those passages. Ariadne 7 had said that the specific word choices in that section were unlike anything else in the Orin linguistic record, that every other passage in the fortress used the probabilistic verb forms, that became open as one outcome of presence construction. But in the sections describing the terminus, the grammar was absolute, declarative. The Orin used their equivalent of is and will be rather than may become. It was the only section of the monument written without conditional grammar. Varath had asked what that meant. Ariadne 7 had said, the Orin were telling whoever read it that this part was not a choice, that the terminus once reached was a fixed point, that every path through the monument led to a threshold, and at the threshold you could choose, and the choosing was full of uncertainty and possibility, but if you deployed the weapon, the uncertainty ended. The probability collapsed to 1. Not victory, not peace, just 1. She had paused then, and the archive recording caught the quality of the pause, which the archivists later noted was unusually long for a Vethkari of her rank. Varath had asked, is that why you made the decision you made on Ardenmere? Ariadne 7 had been quiet for a moment. Then she had said something that the archive translator rendered as, I had been told that humans choose badly and survive. But in the chamber, I saw something that is not choosing badly. I saw someone who chose not to choose, in the moment when choosing would have ended the choice. Varath had asked her to explain. Ariadne 7 had said she had a window. 4 seconds I estimated. She did not use it, not because she could not and not because she was afraid. She did not use it because I was reading the wall. A pause. A species that can do that can hold its own action in suspension, not from weakness but from curiosity. I did not have a category for that in my model. Varath said, and now? And Ariadne 7 said, now I have a better model. She had reached across the archive table and moved Varath's translation notes aside to show the page beneath. The section of the Oran text rendered in careful phonetic approximation, the absolute declarative grammar circled in a color that meant, in the Vethkari annotation system, requires further study. The Oran built this monument, Ariadne 7 said, for the species that would come and have a better choice than they did, a species curious enough to read the wall before they reached for the weapon. She straightened the page. I believe they were writing for humans. I believe they knew, somehow, that such a species would exist. Vareth said, that seems unlikely. Ariadne 7 said, yes, and yet. The Arx Orthian was examined once in the third year of the joint treaty by a team of 4 scholars, 2 human, 2 Vethkari, under the protocol that had been negotiated for 19 months. They were permitted 8 hours in the inner chamber. They were not permitted to touch the artifact, to scan it with active emission equipment, or to remove any material from the site. One of the human scholars later wrote in her published account of the experience that the artifact did nothing for the entire 8 hours. It sat on its plinth. It absorbed light without reflecting it. It had mass and volume and no detectable activity. She wrote that this was the most frightening thing she had ever encountered, and she had spent 30 years studying things that could end civilizations. She wrote, the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. The Arx Orthian is not dormant. It is patient. It is waiting in the specific way that a threshold waits not for a key, but for a decision. The Vethkari scholar on the team published no account. When asked in an interview about the experience, she said only, the Oran understood something about finality that we do not. I think this is why they are not here and we are. The 8 hours expired, the scholars left, the inner chamber sealed. Nobody has proposed opening it since. Years later, a journalist, writing a profile of Mara Keth for the 20th anniversary of the treaty, asked her if she had been afraid in the Ardenmere chamber. She thought about it honestly. She had thought about it many times over many years, and the honest answer had changed, which seemed right to her. Honest answers often did. Yes, she said, Das and Yennik and Rhea were afraid when they died. I had their fear too, as well as mine. That's how fear works when you've been with people. It doesn't leave when they do. The journalist asked if she'd thought she was going to die. Constantly, Mara said. The journalist asked what made the difference. Mara looked at the small hexagonal chip on her desk. She thought about the wall in the entrance corridor, the figures on many paths converging on a door, the empty-handed figure standing in front of it. She thought about Ariadne 7's compound eyes in the sourceless light of the inner chamber, reading text that had been written for her by people who had been dead for centuries, who had spent the last of their civilization's energy on the chance that someone would eventually stand in that room and understand. She thought about a song her grandmother had taught her on a porch that no longer existed. I stopped thinking about whether I was going to die, she said, and started thinking about what was on the wall. The journalist looked at her. That's it, the journalist said. Mara smiled. It was the smile of someone who had spent 20 years watching the answer surprise people, and found it newly surprising every time. That's it, she said. We're very hard to kill when we're paying attention to something else. The journalist published the profile. It ran with a photograph of Mara at her desk, the chip visible in the background, slightly out of focus. One copy reached the Vethkari diplomatic archive through standard treaty channels. It was translated and filed. It reached Ariadne 7, retired herself by then, working in the interpretive role that was not quite an exile and not quite an honor, teaching the young scholars about the Oran and the fortress, and the decisions made in dead places. She read the profile in the long afternoon light of the archive reading room. It was late in the season. The archive was in a city on a Vethkari colony world that had not been in the war's contested zone, a place Ariadne 7 had never been posted before her reassignment. The light came in through a long horizontal window at an angle that was different from the fortress's sourceless amber. This light had direction, had source, had a star behind it that still burned normally in a system that had not been touched by the war or the weapon or the choice made in the sea of dust. She appreciated that sometimes, the uncomplicated light. At the line about paying attention to something else, the color patterns across her skin moved in the slow, contemplative undulation that Mara had seen in the chamber and never quite been able to name. She sat with it for a long time. She thought about SS Varath, her old linguist advisor, who had revised her human intelligence model 14 times and whose final published monograph had been titled, in direct translation, On the Failure of Stability as a Predictive Framework for Adaptive Species. SS Varath had not named humans anywhere in the monograph. She hadn't needed to. Anyone who read the Ardenmere record understood what the paper was about. She thought about the 6 soldiers she had brought to Ardenmere, and the one who had come back into the chamber with his weapon raised. She thought about what she had said to him in that moment, the single word that had made him lower it. She had not used a command. She had used a question. She had asked him what he was looking at. Not the human, not the threat assessment, not the weapon in her hand. What are you actually looking at in this room? He had looked. He had lowered the weapon. He had not understood why. Later, when the case against her was being built by the Directorate, he had been one of 3 soldiers who had refused to testify to her incapacity for judgment. She had not asked him to do that. He had done it because he had stood in that room and been asked what he was seeing, and whatever he had seen, it had been enough. Then she filed the profile in a folder she kept separate from the official archive. A personal record, things she was still figuring out. She went back to teaching. SS Varath published a 15th revision of her model in the final year of her life. She sent a copy to Mara Keth through the treaty diplomatic channel. There was no note, just the document. Mara read it over 2 evenings and found on the last page a single line in the Oran linguistic notation that had been appended in a different typeface, added after the rest of the document was already set. It was from the entrance corridor wall, the symbol for choice. And next to it in handwritten trade pigeon, maybe this one. Mara kept that page too. And on Ardenmere, in the fortress, in the inner chamber, the Orcs Orthian sat on its plinth in the sourceless light. The walls said what they said. The red sun tracked across the white flat. The Dead Sea kept its silence. And in the silence, if you knew how to read it, was everything the Oran had wanted to tell the ones who came after, that the choice mattered more than the weapon, that the path mattered more than the end of the path, that the figure who arrived at the door with empty hands was not surrendering. They were ready.